12 in the Atelier of Power series, the organizational series. We do have one section here on interpreters. Now, what are the qualities of a good interpreter? In teaching workshops, very often the trainer, Rowland, Barkley, most usually the consciousness designer, will in fact in the workshop be designing consciousness. Therefore the voice tones will change, the voice rhythms will change, and various things will be said in unexpected ways and unpredictable rhythms. Now, the translator will be going into resonance and will speak in these unpredictable rhythms, in these various voice tones. Certain interpreters on occasion may need some slightly different resonance. For example, when I once said to Daniel, speak in a deep, cavernous voice, for a moment he said, what's that? Speak in a raw linen voice. And he spoke in a deep, cavernous voice because he was a professor of fashion, and any fabric I named he could speak in that voice. So if he spoke in a shiny silk voice, it would have a completely different effect than if he spoke in the raw linen voice. So the interpreter will be in resonance to what the teacher is actually saying, which of course means not being involved in the reaction of the people to this. It does not exist that the interpreter would participate in a joke or laugh before the audience, for example, because the audience, that is something the audience does. If the teacher says some funny thing, the audience is the ones that react. But if the teacher says a funny thing with a serious face, the interpreter will say a funny thing with a serious face. That would completely break the energy to take the position of the audience, and for the interpreter to laugh at the joke first. In fact, the joke would have none of its intended benefits. We would expect or prefer that interpreters have some rather advanced vocabulary, because there are really so many things that are so simple that cannot easily be said without some reasonable vocabulary. Even how one uses voice tones to create an effect on an audience is almost impossible to say without some knowledge of mathematics and the theory of music, for example. So even if the audience would not particularly know those terms, well then the interpreter would need to be able to follow. In most cases it is better to have an interpreter who is female when the trainer is male, so it is not two males repeating the same message. It can work with two males, but very often it's more successful with a female interpreting for a male. And one important quality of an interpreter is to be able to actually relay the message. Now that might sound simple, and in fact it is, but where sometimes it becomes a problem is that almost everything said by a consciousness designer is designing consciousness, and then therefore by definition is not the effect of some pre-programmed consciousness in the head of the interpreter or in the head of the students on the course. Therefore almost everything said will be unexpected, almost everything said will be out of the box. So the interpreter will be simply repeating the simple message rather than repeating what he thought somebody else said about that subject. I believe that is some of the main factors of an interpreter. Some people wonder how it is that I can be successfully interpreted by somebody where I do not know the language. So to clarify this, in the first or second workshop I held in Sao Paulo, I dismissed two interpreters, or actually called them translators, because most so-called translators don't know the word interpreter, when the word interpreter means somebody that translates verbally, and a translator is somebody that translates written material. So in both English and Portuguese, translator is a completely incorrect word to use for a person who is speaking what I say in a workshop. So when I dismissed the first two translators, some people thought I was a little tough on them. And then when I watched the videos 10 years later, I saw that every correction I made was extremely important. They had in fact said the opposite than I had said, like they reversed the key word, which is why I had to dismiss them. They had a compulsion to actually communicate the opposite. And how would I know how to do this? Well, actually it's very simple. As I speak, I am creating an image beside me, between me and the interpreter, of exactly what I'm saying. And if the interpreter said correctly what I built in the image disappears. If the image sits there, it hasn't been communicated yet. So I have to ask them to speak in a different way, or solve the problem or replace them until such time as I speak, making an image, that the interpreter speaks, the image has dissolved. So actually the technique is quite simple. I actually spoke with a interpreter who interpreted in Sao Paulo for the famous philosopher scientist Buckminster Fuller, and this scientist was so shocked that Fuller could correct every little error he made, even though Fuller understood no Portuguese. Well, that's how it is done. Correct communication means the image isn't waiting there to be communicated, so it's not actually so complicated.